So I've been reading a book about ancient Mesopotamia, and I wanted to do a video talking about kind of some of the interesting things I've learned, some of the insights, because it's very fascinating. Because much as with Egypt, this is where we're getting back to the real beginnings of civilization. Sumeria is generally considered to be the first civilization, and so they, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Egyptians, the Hittites, etc., had to kind of make everything up from scratch. You get to see really how civilization first developed without any kind of precedent to build on. So it's a very fascinating time in human history. As I've said in the past, when it comes to kind of politics and my views, I'm very much about, I don't know what if you want to call it, political naturalism, that kind of thing, where when you look at what works and how you should run a society, I think it's very important to take the long view of human history, to go back and see what did all successful societies have in common. What worked for pretty much everybody, what didn't work for pretty much anybody, what are kind of these eternal truths of how to structure a society, etc. And we can really see a lot of things in ancient Mesopotamia that became that we see repeated again and again and throughout human history. Interestingly, some of the things we see back then kind of were in an interregnum and have come back more recently. But it always interests me how different peoples across the world independently developed similar institutions. By that I mean successful societies, societies that achieve things like culture, religion, they build monuments, they create written language, all the things we kind of generally associate with being a civilization. Because I mean, things like patriarchy, things like the nuclear family, hierarchy, normally monarchy, codes of laws, etc., all seem to develop independently in every society. Like in the ancient Aztec Empire, you had monogamous marriages for most of the lower class. Now, in societies, it was often different. The upper classes normally practiced polygamy, but for the vast majority of the population, it was largely monogamy. That developed in China, that developed in Japan. Granted, they still had polygamy for the upper classes, but that's kind of irrelevant. It developed in the Aztec Empire, etc. I think kind of one of the biggest insights I ever gained in my life was when I realized that the ancient peoples were not stupid. I mean, the modern approach is just to say they were ignorant, they didn't know what they were doing, they were just superstitious and dumb. But in a lot of cases, what they came up with was completely logical and rational. Like, before we get into kind of the rest of it, for instance, when you look at ancient punishments, if you look at in Babylonia, if someone from the upper class hit someone, like attacked someone from the upper class, like they beat them, they cheated them, etc., that's when they applied the eye for an eye punishments. Like if they beat someone from the upper class, then they'd get beaten, but if they beat someone from the lower class, they'd pay them a fine. Now, on kind of face value, this looks like, oh, this is injustice. This is a different standard for the upper class. But then when you kind of look into it, you go, wait a minute. So I think it's something like the average person would make 1 shekel of silver a month for their labor. And the normal, I think like the average fine from the upper class to the lower class was 60 shekels of silver. So that's like 6 years that's 5 years of wages. So if you're a lower class person, you much rather have that than the satisfaction of the guy getting beaten. So I mean, that's a much more kind of fair and just punishment than it appears on the surface. Kind of another one is trial by ordeal, which I think people misunderstand. Trial by ordeal is if there isn't really definitive evidence in ancient or even kind of early medieval legal case. What they would do is the accused would have to submit to a trial by ordeal, be that being bound and thrown into the river, or something else where there's a likely chance of death. Now, the the purpose behind it was in a lot of cases to determine whether or not the person was telling the truth. The idea being that if the person was telling a truth, they would maintain their innocence and submit themselves to the trial by ordeal, even if the trial itself was worse than what the legal punishment would be. Whereas if the person was guilty, they'd probably just confess. You also have to understand, and we think this is just kind of nonsense, so we can't understand it now. People did legitimately believe that the gods controlled every aspect of their lives. They did believe that if they lied, that they would die during the trial or of under by ordeal or succeed. So once again, it was an incentive to either insist on their innocence or to confess. You have to take these things in the context; they make a lot of sense. So let's start talking about kind of the legal system of the ancient world. In ancient Mesopotamia. So it's very interesting because it does have a lot of similarities to our legal system. Now, before we get into it, I'd just like to make another kind of general statement. It's interesting because whenever you look at historians of a particular era, what they always will say without fail is women were treated better in this society than they were in other societies. So, like, when I took medieval history in university, they're like, well, women were treated better during this era than they were in others. If you read books about Mongolian Empire, they'll say, oh, Mongol women were more free. If you in this book, they're saying, oh, in ancient Mesopotamia, women had more rights than you might think, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, maybe there's this false narrative that women were just arbitrarily oppressed throughout history. That it wasn't that they had a different role in society that was considered as important as men. It's that everyone just irrationally hated them prior to the modern era. Like it's interesting. So in regarding women in ancient Mesopotamia, women were allowed to own property. They could work. They could go and work for the civil service, or they could go and work for temples. When they were given a dowry, I believe it was a little confusing in the book, but I believe women were allowed to keep their dowry and manage it. It was supposed to be kind of similar to the inheritance that male children got. Women were allowed to divorce their husbands if their husbands were abusive or had committed some other crime against them. They were allowed to do that. Widows, generally speaking, have a pretty high status in most kind of ancient or medieval societies because they were allowed to keep all their property. Often their property would go to their eldest son, and people see this as unfair, but I mean, that's who you leave your property to. Yeah, so women would often, obviously, they'd weave, they would run taverns, making beer was very important. Watered down alcohol was kind of the dominant drink for most of human history because the alcohol will kill the bacteria in it. So the Romans would almost exclusively, from my research, would drink very watered down wine, very watered down cheap wine, but there'd be enough alcohol in it that it'd kill the bacteria and it'd make it safe. It's not like they were chugging modern bottles of concentrated wine. Now, what's kind of interesting in ancient Mesopotamia, despite a lot of these rights that women had, was it was a very patriarchal society. The man was the head of the household. But I think another thing you have to understand within the context of a patriarchal society is the men were expected to unconditionally support, provide for the women, and to protect them. If you look at medieval societies, etc., if someone insulted your wife and demeaned her character, it was kind of your job to go and kill the guy. And there's this thing like, if they were so oppressed, why was there such this dominant feeling that you had to protect them? A kind of a common parable in ancient Mesopotamia was like a man who didn't provide for his wife and children was scum. It was his job to defend them. So it was these things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. You can have a very patriarchal society, but also have good treatment for women. I think part of it is just soured by how Islam treats women, which is a lot more negative and a lot less balanced than a lot of other societies. But once again, there's kind of a point to that because it's kind of an interesting, and I'm sorry if this is digression, but once again, we're talking about the general theme of that things develop for a reason. there's this thing about the hijab where Westers will say, oh, if they see a little skin, are they just going to rape the woman? And the answer is yes, they will. You're dealing with people who don't have much impulse control. So it's to a certain extent necessary to keep women covered and to keep them in the houses and to observe them. Just because if you look at what they're often like with the refugees and stuff, with just how common rape is when you don't have these extreme measures, it starts to make sense why these things developed and were instituted. Not to say that they're good or anything, but they're a lot more logical than I think a lot of people would see at first blush. So one of the interesting things about the ancient Mesopotamian legal or ancient Mesopotamian society, it depends a bit on the era, but there was to a large extent a the class system was a little more flat wealth wise than some other societies in history. The upper class were just people who owned anything. I guess we kind of consider them freeholders or free peasants in pretty much any other age. So it was they might own a house or some farmland, etc., whereas the lower class rented. And there was a wealth difference between them, but it wasn't huge. I think it depended on the era, but there wasn't quite as much intervening nobility. There was kind of the lower class who were renters, freemen renters. There was I guess you could say, middle class, which is kind of free peasants, I guess you could call them. Then there's the upper class, which was the priests, and then the ruling class. I don't think there was a ton of nobility, to be honest. It was mainly just kind of royal families, and there'd be a number of royal families. Federal monarchy was very common during this time period, where you'd have, within like the Assyrian Empire, every city would be ruled by a vassal king. But there wasn't a ton of people in between. And the legal system was very concerned, and if you look at like Hammurabi and what a lot of the king's decrees were, they'll say, I did not offer up the poor to the rich. There was a lot of focus on trying to ensure equal justice, that they wouldn't just side with the wealthy person, and there's a lot of kind of things in place for that. Interestingly, the ancient Mesopotamian legal system was very heavily based on evidence, which is probably something that you don't realize, but inheritance was extremely important, and inheritance almost always had a legal contract, which once again is not something you expect. I assume they would go to a temple or something and get a scribe to write it up. Then they'd bake it, because baked clay tablets last pretty much forever. And sometimes people would keep multiple copies of it, and when the person died, they go to a court or priests or whatever, they'd read the tablet and they distribute the property. And every tablet would have, I think most people, at least most middle class people, would have seals. And whenever a will was made or a contract was made, there was always witnesses who would put their seal in it, and then the court could later call them. Which once again is a very kind of modern, I guess you could say, I guess it's not modern because this is the first civilization, but what we consider a very modern idea. You have evidence, you have witnesses, you have written contracts, you have a court that's trying to be impartial and to learn the truth. So yeah, it was very common, like if there's a crime committed, they get witnesses to come in and testify after swearing an oath to the gods to tell the truth. The judges would hear the case, etc. And there wasn't really a formal legal code. I mean, we talked about the Code of Hammurabi, etc., but to a certain extent, that was more kind of precedence. Precedent was extremely important to the ancient Mesopotamians, where courts would kind of look at kind of past legal precedent as well as evidence and witness testimony, and that was how they reached their decision, which once again, I mean, I don't want to make too fine a point on it, but that does sound a lot like common law, doesn't it? Because isn't that what common law is? It's not based on kind of a rational pre-existing legal code. It's something that's built up over time using precedent to help with it. Also, it's interesting because we don't know a ton about it. It's interesting because in some ways with ancient Mesopotamia, we know a lot and we know we know very little. because there is a lot of how do you pronounce it, cuneiform tablets, because unlike in Egypt and some other countries, they use clay to write on, and clay lasts pretty much forever. What often would happen is if buildings would burn down or they'd be put to the torch, baked clay lasts pretty much forever because it's basically like pottery. So they'll find a lot of clay tablets that'll have intact writing on it from like 3,000 years ago. But kind of during this time period, literature and government treaties and philosophy weren't really a big thing, so it's mostly administrative records. But having a whole bunch of administrative records is a lot better than having nothing, which is what you have for a lot of periods of Egypt, because they wrote on papyrus, which tends to rot and fall apart over time. Well, it doesn't rot, it just gets dry and it kind of falls apart over time. So, from what we might consider to be the less sophisticated writing system actually proved to be more enduring. So another kind of interesting thing they said, and once again we don't know a ton about this, but cities had assemblies. So you do have representation here. Kings would help the governance of a city. They'd have a representative assembly, and the book says that this came from all different levels of society. This came from the peasantry, this came from the upper class, the priests, etc. And they'd periodically meet and kind of present their demands to the king, or they'd hear legal cases, etc. Kind of similar to what you had in ancient Greece. But I think once again we have this, particularly with a lot of kind of modern neo-reactionaries, this idea that not necessarily democracy, because that's a very kind of different concept, but representation is as old as civilization itself. Representation has always been there, and it kind of, I think, to a certain extent reflects poorly on like the czars and some of the French kings, that they were unwilling to really create a representative body, because this is not kind of like a modern invention of the Enlightenment. This is something that most societies have had, or a lot of societies have had throughout human history. So there's kind of some other interesting laws during this time period. Was if you beat a woman and she had a miscarriage, then you were executed for murder. So what I'm saying is the ancient Mesopotamians had more protections for the unborn than modern Canada does, which is kind of funny. So just talking a bit about marriage. So marriage functioned more or less the same as it did now. Women were obviously, their marriages were arranged. However, widows could marry whoever they wanted, and widows are fairly common in a lot of societies because men tend to work harder jobs. They tend to die in war. Women just naturally live longer than men. So it's. I remember reading about America. It wasn't uncommon for women to have 2 or 3 husbands throughout their lifetime, and they'd keep their property from a previous marriage. They'd often be desirable, so they were allowed to pick who they'd marry before. Now, there was a strong expectation that love would develop during marriage. So marriages were obviously, they were prearranged, but there was an expectation that, or in a hope that real affection would develop between the couple. And parents definitely loved their children. Within the legal code, and this is once again something we see in Christian teaching and in pretty much every successful society, the family is the base unit of the society. The individual is not the base unit of society, it's the family. Particularly what we'd probably call the nuclear family. You have the wife, the husband, the children, and then normally the parents. Men normally remained the head of the household until they died, so oftentimes the patriarch of the family would be the grandfather or the father of the current father. So if they would live, because sometimes people just live a long time, particularly if they survive childhood, and they're like, if the father was 70 years old, then he'd remain the head of the household even if his son was like 50 or whatever, until his death. So you'd have that, and that would kind of be the unit, and they'd live together in a house. And then the extended family, brothers, cousins, etc., would live in houses nearby. Women were expected to maintain contact with their parents and siblings after they married, and there was an expectation that they would help you out. If her family was having trouble, her brothers and parents would go to their aid. Adoption was interestingly very common. You also see this in ancient Rome where adoption is very common. If a couple didn't have enough children, they were very likely to adopt some. So I guess I didn't I don't think we really have statistics, but I imagine orphans weren't really a thing, provided they were able-bodied in ancient Mesopotamia. Now, when they adopted a kid, they had to write a contract stating that they would receive equal treatment to their other children, including a share of the inheritance, as if they were the as if they were a biological child, which is once again very interesting, and I guess kind of, I don't want to use the term progressive, but it's something we'd consider kind of an enlightened thing in the modern era. But as with a lot of traditional societies, the expectation was adult children would take care of their parents. Now, Mesopotamia kind of had a mixed system of succession. All male children would get a inheritance. Obviously, the woman would get her inheritance at the time of her dowry, but the eldest son would get an extra share. So he'd probably get the bulk of the estate. But money, lands, houses, farm animals, etc., would go to all the other children. And from my understanding, dynastic succession was male primogeniture. Another kind of interesting thing is concubines and second wives, their children were considered to be fully legitimate, and they also received inheritances kind of on an equal standing. So kind of some other just interesting tidbits was some rulers would offer interest-free loans to their subjects, because anytime in a farming society, you need credit, because farmers might have a very high net wealth because they have land, they have crops, they have farm animals, they have their barns, etc. So a lot of farmers might be functionally millionaires because good cropland is always valuable, but they have very little liquid wealth because it's all tied up in seed, etc. And they don't make money until the crops are harvested, and they'll make a ton of money then, but it'll have to last them for the rest of the year, and they'll have to spend a lot of that capital to do crops the next year. So temples and I think temples would often offer it at an interest rate, but something a just king would do is to offer loans with no interest rate to his subjects, so that farmers, like I said, could buy grain. They could buy seed grain. It could get them through until the harvest was kind of the idea, although there was an expectation that they paid back. Hammurabi and some of the Babylonian kings would periodically issue forgiveness of all existing debts, which is something that the ancient Hebrews would eventually come up with, that was known as the Jubilee, in which all slaves would be freed and all debts would be forgiven, because in a lot of cases, particularly if there's a couple bad harvests in a row, farmers would just never functionally be able to pay off the debts that they had incurred. And it's not really their fault. It's not as if they were living extravagant lifestyles. It's just kind of the way things would go. You just sometimes have a bunch of bad harvests. So that's kind of just some thoughts on the legal system and the social structure of ancient Mesopotamia. I think it's very interesting. Once again, we're seeing the beginnings of human civilization, and we're seeing that most successful civilizations adopt very similar institutions. There's a lot of differences between them, but there's also a lot of similarities between them. So I hope you found the video interesting, and more content to come.